South Korea is over.
It's all based on this premise that the populations start dipping continuously. And, that's the part I would contend you just don't know. Hey, everybody, welcome back. Today, Dad is reacting to Kurzgesagt. In a nutshell, South Korea is over.
South Korea is over. This sounds brutal, but South Korea will soon start melting on all fronts. Demographically, economically, socially, culturally, and militarily. Because for decades, the country has been experiencing a fertility crisis unprecedented in human history. And we've probably reached a point of no return. By 2060, the South Korea we know and love today will no longer exist. What will the collapse look like? And why is it now almost impossible to stop the real population bomb?
Each person is producing less than a person technically. So over time, that recipe for the population dwindling and dwindling further and further. But it's also hard to imagine that something like that happens. I don't know what the population of South Korea is. Let's take a look. 51.71 million people. So there's quite a few people in South Korea. Say you bring it down at some point in time to like 5 million people. If the fertility rate is very low for long periods of time and population diminishes, there'll become a lot of open resources available and people want to have more babies. Probably the resource availability is not that great in South Korea for a typical person, and so therefore they don't want to have a lot of babies.
By 2060, the South Korea we know and love today will no longer exist. What will the collapse look like? And why is it now almost impossible to stop? The real population bomb. To have a stable population, you need a fertility rate of about 2.1 children per woman. In the 1950s, South Koreans used to have 6 children on average. In the 1980s, the rate fell below 2. And in 2023, it was 0.72 kids per woman, the lowest ever recorded in history. In Seoul, fertility is even lower, around 0.55. On average, about half of the women here won't have any kids, and the other half just one. What do these numbers actually mean in the real world? If fertility stays as it is, then 100 South Koreans will have 36 kids. When they grow up, they will have 13 kids, who will then have 5.
When you start getting out into these situations, I think the mindset will be drastically different than you were back over here. And as a result, people would generally just want to have more kids. I think that's just going to be a natural occurrence. It's not like the people are unable to have kids. They're just choosing not to.
Within 4 generations, 100 South Koreans will turn into 5. If we look at today's South Korean population pyramid, we see this is pretty real. There's only one 1-year-old for 4 50-year-olds. After 4 decades below the replacement level, the consequences were still largely invisible. Today,
Some might even argue that what you're seeing occur in a place like South Korea is a country that's sort of hit maybe its maximum carrying capacity, and now it's just dipping down a little bit. With any population, if you start lowering it enough, it will start to rise due to just more resources that are available. People will start having more kids. The urge to have the kids is always going to be there.
Korea's population is at an all-time high, as are its workforce and its GDP, which is still growing. But demographics hits you like a freight train. You hear it vaguely in the distance, and then it runs you over. South Korea is about to be hit. Let's time travel 35 years into the future to 2060 and see what the country will look like.
Oh, now this is a fun adventure we're about to take off on. I mean, this is what everybody would love to do, right? Let's time travel into the future. So our creator here, Kurzgesagt, has now given us the opportunity to time travel into the future, and it already looks really cool, I have to admit, with the rings and the big tall towers.
When it comes to demographics, the most commonly used projections are those put together by the UN. They envisage 3 scenarios: low fertility, medium, and high. But in the past, all medium UN projections for South Korea have consistently been too positive. Between 2022 and 2023 alone, fertility in South Korea dropped by another 8%. So we're going to use the latest low fertility scenario, which has been the most accurate in the last few years. Keep in mind that we're still talking about projections, and the future is a faraway land. Okay, let's do it. In 2060, South Korea's population pyramid will look like this. The population will have shrunk by 30%. 16 million South Koreans will have disappeared in just 35 years. And it'll be the oldest country in human history. 1 in 2 South Koreans will be over the age of 65. less than 1 in 10 will be under 25. And only 1 in 100 will be small children. Imagine waking up 5 years, and it'll be the oldest country in human history. 1 in 2 South Koreans will be over the age of 65. Less than 1 in 10 will be under 25.
Projections are a slippery thing to manage in all types of modeling systems. If you think about something like Social Security, if you have this enormous elderly population being supported by a smaller and smaller and smaller working class, that system just doesn't work. South Korea's Social Security system comprises 4 main social insurance components: public pension scheme. So that's like Social Security, I'd say similar to what ours is. They have the equivalent of what we would have Social Security-wise. 1 in 2 South Koreans will be under the age of 65. So that means half the population is essentially retired, and they'll be collecting retirement benefits. And all of these other people have to help pay for their benefits. And what eventually happens, as this side of the puzzle gets smaller and smaller, the amount that these people can receive becomes less and less, unless there has been a trust fund of some sorts that's been saved up over time and is able to generate a lot of interest and revenue.
Less than 1 in 10 will be under 25, and only 1 in 100 will be small children. Imagine waking up in a country where the streets are strangely quiet with no children playing on them. Entire cities have been abandoned. Half of the population is elderly and living either alone or in overcrowded retirement homes, with a minority of people desperately trying to keep society.
I like how they show the elderly people having a good time, at least. I feel like this is taking a particular slant towards what could or could not happen, and that's what it is. So it's just a projection. We might see that the population drops maybe 5-10 million, and then it starts to come right back up again. It might just not continue to just keep falling and falling and falling forever.
Running. There will be a few major...
South Korea's fertility rate has plummeted in the past 20 years due to a complex mix of factors, including the high cost of living, a demanding work culture, gender inequality, and a competitive educational system which pushes individuals to prioritize careers and personal achievements over family formation. High cost of living and housing. If everything is so expensive, especially to have a kid and send a kid to school, it's going to limit your desire to want to, have a kid, which just turns into a financial burden for you to carry. And you could have a better quality of life if you don't have a kid. And it's kind of sad because having kids is really your main biological purpose, no matter what you want to say. I mean, you're put on this earth, and the only reason you're put here is because somebody else had a kid, okay? And you think you're pretty important, and you're special, and your opinion matters. And the only reason why any of that even exists is because someone else had a kid. So when you think about, then what's your job? Well, your job is to also have a kid. That's how it all keeps going, folks.
There will be a few major consequences. Economic collapse. In 2023, a breathtaking 40% of South Koreans over 65 lived below the poverty line. But in 2060, this number may seem lovely in comparison.
Yeah, 40% of people 65 and older live under the poverty line. That sounds terrible. That's very sad. And that doesn't sound like whatever that pension system is that's taking care of people, that these people are paying like 9-10% of their salary into. Doesn't sound like that's taking care of the people very well. 40% of the people that are collecting those pensions are living under the poverty line.
40% of South Koreans over 65 live below the poverty line, but in 2060, this number may seem lovely in comparison. Today, South Korea has one of the largest pension funds in the world, worth about $730 billion US. But it's projected to stop growing in the 2040s and be completely depleted by the 2050s. So in 2060, pensions will have to be paid by the working population. Estimates vary, but for a pension system to work, the minimum a society needs is between 2 to 3 workers per retiree paying for them with their taxes. But even if we assume that all South Koreans over 15 will be working in 2060, the country will have less than 1 worker per senior. Workers will be unable to stem the incredible costs. So not only will poverty among the elderly be common, but a big chunk will be forced to work. Except they may not be able to find jobs because by 2060, the South Korean economy may have collapsed. Broadly speaking, the size of an economy is linked to the size of its workforce. To have a big economy, you need a lot of workers to produce a lot of things and a lot more people to buy them. Today, South Korea has about 37 million people of working age, generating a GDP of about $1.7 trillion US. But by 2060, its workforce would have shrunk to less than half, to about 17 million. Of course, technological progress. But by 2060, its workforce would have shrunk to less than half.
Yeah, and this is the big if. It shows that the population increased from 1950 up until the mid 2000s here, and then it peaked. And now it's come down this much. And I'll take you to any population curve for anything. Population graph over time. So for example, here's a number of individuals, millions, and they're studying rabbits in some part of the world. And notice that the population steadily increases from 1992 to 2002. Then it goes through a decline in population here, then a flattening, then it increased, then a flattening. But generally it starts to stay at a level, something like this, and that's what's known as carrying capacity. It looks like to me that's what's going to happen, is we're going to have something like this, and I just feel like this is what happens with populations. Instead, they just give you this very bleak outcome that it's just going to continue to fall, and that's generally not what you see happen in populations of animals.
Half to about 17 million. Of course, technological progress means that productivity will be higher and each individual will probably produce more than today. But even if productivity keeps growing at the same rate or more than we've seen in the last decades, South Korea's GDP could peak in the 2040s. In other words, South Korea will enter a permanent economic recession. There are more optimistic projections that see the recession begin as late as 2050, but they're based on the medium UN demographic scenario, and there are no signs that we're heading there. Another factor in the economy is science, technology, and innovation, areas in which big leaps are typically made by young adults and the middle-aged. Young people have fresh ideas that contribute to the wealth of society. Significantly fewer people working also means way less tax for the government, which will be trapped between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, having to provide for half the population that are seniors, on the other, seeing its income diminish. It will be
it's valued at $830 billion US dollars, $110 billion in investment gains in 2024. 4% interest on $830 billion would yield $33.2 billion in interest annually. They have 10.24 million people. So that comes to $3,242 per person each year that just the interest can pay. Yeah, so when you break down the numbers, you could see how they could be in trouble. So that's not much money at all. That's not maybe even like enough for 1 month. So that's why you have a lot of people living in poverty in South Korea.
Population that are seniors, on the other, seeing its income diminish. It will be forced to shut down or cut essential services like hospitals or social benefits. Since infrastructure only works at scale, smaller communities may be abandoned as the country contracts into its metropolitan areas. And of course, there won't be enough money to invest in the future. This is bad. But what will happen to South Korean society and culture may be worse. Societal and cultural collapse. Speculating on how societies will develop is extra hard, but there are a few pretty unavoidable trends. Today, already about 20% of Koreans live alone. Also, 20% report having no close friends or relatives. By 2060, 50% of South Koreans aged 70 will have no siblings and 30% will have no children. Young adults between 25 and 35 will only make up 5% of the population and typically have no siblings at all. This leaves the elderly with almost no close family and young adults with little family and few potential friends, especially outside of big cities. A loneliness epidemic of epic proportions is all but guaranteed. On top of that, South Korean culture will probably experience a huge decline. In 2000, there were 17.5 million South Koreans between 25 and 45, and they made up 37% of the population. This was the generation that brought us K-pop, K-drama, K-food, and many other trends that spread around the world. In 2060, there will be just 5.6 million people in that age group, and they'll only be 16% of the population. Many cultural traditions are already struggling because the older generations are having trouble finding young people to pass them on to. As young people disappear, many traditions will die out. Without young people, the soul of South Korean culture will shrink and wither away. And on a personal level, what kind of experience will it be growing up in 2060? What will youth culture be like in a country of seniors, where many universities, schools and kindergartens are abandoned as there are no longer children to fill them with life? What kind of job prospects will they face, and what will politics look like? If young people don't want to remain alone, they'll concentrate in Seoul or a few other big cities, or worse for South Korea, emigrate to other countries. Rural areas will decline, and most smaller cities will turn into ghost towns. We're already seeing this in Japan, which has almost 10 million abandoned houses in rural areas. Large parts of South Korea will simply vanish and be reclaimed by nature. Last but not least, South and North Korea are technically at war, and they could very well still be in 2060. Will South Korea still be able to afford to have its young men do 18 months of mandatory military service? Today, 5% of men of combat age are enrolled in the military. In 2060, it would have to be 15% just to match today's numbers. Okay, wait, this is all a bit much. Is there no way back? Why, there really is no way back. The problem with
It's all based on this premise that the population is going to hit this point and then just start dipping and dipping and dipping and dipping continuously. And, that's the part I would contend you just don't know. You don't know that that's just going to be the continued trend. You don't know if people are going to want to start having kids and do what almost every animal population on Earth does.
The demographic freight train is that once it hits, things become irreversible. Let's say fertility in South Korea magically triples to the replacement rate of 2.1 children per woman and stays there. In 2060, it will be an inverted pyramid on top of a barrel. And there would still be only 1.5 people of working age per senior over 65. Even in the best made-up scenario, South Korea has to pass through an unavoidable bottleneck before it will recover. But there is also a kernel of hope here. Yes, the situation is grim, but at least in the long term, recovery is possible if South Korea enacts rapid and societal changes that make its population want to have kids again. In 2024, births rose for the first time in 9 years, 3% more than in 2023. But for that to continue, South Korea...
That's exactly what I was showing on the population curve before. There it goes. It will naturally just do that. That's what happens. So all the doomsaying just seems like a good video. I think it's overkill, and it's like, what if this happens? And, all these bad, horrible dominoes will fall, and you should watch this. I think that's what we got here.
Years, 3% more than in 2023. But for that to continue, South Korea needs to face the music and ask how they got to this point. How could it get that bad? In general, as societies get richer, more educated, and child mortality plummets, people decide to have fewer kids. What makes South Korea special is that it's somehow supercharging all of these trends. South Korea lifted itself out of poverty in record time, but in doing so it developed a unique kind of workaholism and extreme competitiveness. Although the work week is 40 hours and the legal maximum is 52 per week, unpaid overtime is normal for many, and the government even proposed to raise legal work time to 69 hours per week. Despite this, South Korea has relatively low wages and a high cost of living. Real estate in big cities is out of reach for most people. Wages and a high cost of living.
Yeah, and that's the kiss of death for people, right? Is, here's your wages, this is your cost of living, and couple it with taxes, and you got the inflation on top of it that just crushed all these people, and they work 60 hours, 70 hours a week, but they never can get anywhere. And one has to start to question, is the system designed to just do that to you, the worker? You're just born into the system where you just run on this treadmill your whole life, but you can't get anywhere for so many people.
Real estate in big cities is out of reach for most people. The cost of education is extremely high, since families have to pay for private lessons if they want to send their kids to a high-tier college. All of this while South Korea spends less on family benefits than most other rich countries. Old-fashioned cultural norms make matters even worse. Have to pay for private lessons if they want to send their kids to a high-tier college. All of this while South Korea spends less on family benefits than most other rich countries. Old-fashioned cultural norms make matters even worse. Marriage is all but mandatory if a couple wants to start a family. In 2023, only 4.7% of babies were born to unmarried women. Out of all developed countries, South Korean men do just about the least share of housework and childcare within their families. This leaves women with a disproportionate amount of work if they want to keep their jobs after a pregnancy, while many men are overwhelmed by the societal expectation to be the main breadwinner and have successful careers. Starting a family or not is a personal decision, and most South Koreans are deciding against it. The bottom line is that South Korea has created a culture that leads to very few kids. Conclusion. Demographic collapse is not an abstract thing in the future, it's happening right now. And it's not just South Korea. In 2023, China had a fertility rate of 1, Italy and Spain 1.2, Germany 1.4, the UK 1.6, and the US 1.6.
Yeah, and maybe that's sort of the goal, is get everybody into this situation like he's describing, where you have this elderly population that just dominates in terms of what they need, and the younger population just gets worked harder and harder and harder, and he becomes more and more isolated. That sort of imagery he was showing of everybody alone in their apartments. And that is when you become super easy prey. If you don't have family to support you and ground you in life, then you become easy prey to what I would just consider corporate interests that want to get you addicted to things like gambling and drugs and things like that, and just turn you into a bag of money for them. Is it just by coincidence that this is happening, or the trend is happening?
Which sounds so much better, doesn't it? Well, after 4 generations, a fertility rate of 1.6 means 60% fewer new people. A fertility rate of 1.2 means 87% fewer people. And fertility rates are still falling with no sign of stabilization or recovery. The weirdest thing about all of this is that almost nobody involved in the public discourse has truly grasped the gravity of the situation. The last century was utterly dominated by overpopulation narratives, and people who say that we need more kids seem weird. And if you do the maths, the future just seems to be too insane to be true, like it's hard to believe. None of this has ever happened before. So low birth rates are mostly discussed in the context of worker shortages, not as the existential threat to our societies, cultures, wealth, and our way of life that they are. If we don't take it seriously very soon and change the DNA of our modern societies in a way that encourages young people to start having children again, then the rest of the century will be pretty grim for those of us who will live through it. The demographic freight train stops for nobody. We finally need to realize that it's hurtling down the tracks right at us.
And I think that's the point of this video, is to shock you into thinking like, look what's going to happen. And again, maybe it will, and maybe it won't. And maybe, like they said, in 2024, population of South Korea actually started to go back up. And that's, I think, the greatest indicator that you're not looking at a collapse, that you're looking at what's called natural population growth, hits a sort of carrying capacity where there's just not a lot of resources there for new members. And so things will start to dip and then go back up, and you get, hovering around a certain threshold. And maybe that's what's going to happen. And maybe it's not all doom and gloom. I'll see you next time. Take care.